the overarching pattern over time is one of a dawning of a kind of moral enlightenment. It's not, as you point out, it does not prevent the alternatives from repeatedly reemerging, right? But I mean, let's take, for example...
But how can we even call it enlightenment? Why is it not just our preference?
Let's take the story of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the story of Jesus, if I understand it, and I'm no biblical scholar, but if I understand that story, the key elements of it, or at least several key elements of it, involve a broadening of the sense of self, right? A broadening of the in-group. This is what the story of the Good Samaritan tells us.
All right, so I would tweak that a bit. It is a broadening of our sense of duty and responsibility and our capacity to love and serve others in proper relationship to God. So insofar as our capacity is increased, right, it's a broadening of our understanding of ourselves in relation to properly ordered unto submission to the Lordship and all that brings about. Jesus came and it was an elevation. It wasn't a dispensing of the old law. It was a completion of the old laws. It was a, hey, look, you guys have known about the surface level dictates of the law. Now I'm going to teach you about the heart posture and the intention of the law. So it was a broadening in that sense, certainly, but I think that we don't want to place too much emphasis, and I know he's not a believer, but I'm speaking to believers and those who hopefully will come to believe and want to express the most clear understanding of this from a theological perspective. We don't want to place too much emphasis on ourselves. And we're about to talk a lot about the narrative and narrative in general of Scripture. And obviously, as a more materialist guy, he's going to take a pretty strict, biologically utilitarian approach to the Scriptures and the narrative function of that, and he's going to relate it to game theory and all these things, which is going to be interesting, and we'll talk about it.
This is what the golden rule is. This is, love your enemy. Now, those things are a radical increase in the inclusion of others into an in-group.
So it certainly represented a broadening of the inclusion of others insofar as that broadening of the inclusion of others was consequential to the submission to the Lordship of Christ, the submission to the Spirit of Christ, and the selflessness associated with that at the expense of my own pursuits, which causes, of course, us to then become the kind of people who are more selfless and kind and loving and caring and inclusive. That's a word that has been hijacked, so I want to be careful using it. I don't mean it in a politically liberal sense at all. I mean it according to the most objectively understood definition of the word. Proper inclusion. We're not going to outcast individuals over arbitrary, traditionally believed reasons, which are not founded in anything objective or meaningful, right? Tradition is valuable insofar as it properly aims at objective reality, at objective moral good.
Now, imagine for a moment that Jesus had said these things in game theoretic terms, and he had tried to convince people with whatever the equivalent of a whiteboard would have been of, the reasons to broaden the in-group at this moment in history. It's preposterous.
Yeah, so this is super interesting. So me and Nick were literally having this conversation earlier. Why did God choose to use certain ideas, certain phrases, certain words? Why did he say certain things at certain times? Why did he choose to do that? Why did he choose to utilize those words instead of other words, right? God necessarily must condescend to human understanding. Our limited nature necessitates God coming down, meeting us where we are, and then operating within the confines of the context we understand. So the question, well, why did God use this word or that word, assumes, first of all, that had God chosen other words, the outcomes would have been better. So we were talking about, for instance, how the entire Roman church, it rests on the verse, on this rock I'll build my church, when he was talking to Peter. The way that's been interpreted has caused the development and the perpetuation of the Roman Catholic Church. And Nick was saying, Jesus was God. He understood the consequence of using this language. Why then did he use it? And I said, hey, look, if we go there, we have to apply that same logic to a ton of different, we could apply that to everything he said, right? Everything that's in Scripture can be misinterpreted. So what could he say which would not be misinterpreted? The problem is misinterpretation is a consequence of our finite understanding of reality and our incomplete, our incomplete language library, right? We don't have enough words or enough capacity to be able to remember and then, recall enough words to communicate on the same level that God could in perfect understanding of all reality, right? So necessarily, we're going to have to deal in the realm of incomplete language, and God had to utilize the incomplete language, which we are familiar with, in order to communicate the ideas to the best possible degree. So there's that idea, and then there's also the question relies on the idea that the struggling with passages is bad. Well, who's to say it's bad, right? That's just something we're positing. We've just decided it's bad. I kind of tend to believe that we're supposed to contend with the Scriptures. We're supposed to wrestle with this stuff. I think that's a lot of where the growth happens. That's a lot of where the relational development, right? Think about this. God isn't physically here with us. We can't go to lunch with Jesus, okay? So what are the methods by which we engage in relational growth with the Lord? Well, prayer, communion with others, right? But then in our own minds, in our own personal lives, in our private time, I think a lot of where we get to know God is wrestling with the Scriptures. Jordan Peterson's book that he wrote, We Who Wrestle with God, honestly is a super profound idea, right? There's something deeply important. And I think built into the system about wrestling with ideas, wrestling with these things breeds relationship, depth of understanding. We contend with these things, and I think that's actually a feature of Scripture, not a bug. And Bret is talking about understanding the idea that human beings, we sort of think in our Western modern world that we see everything through that lens. We see things through the lens of our modern Western technical worldview. And we assume that that's the best way to view things and to approach topics and ideas. Jesus really spoke in parables, I think, because obviously, as God, he understood, not only he understood it, he designed it such that people would be most taken with an idea through its proper modeling. That's why Jesus lived in a certain way. He modeled effectively the deep principles which he wished to communicate. And then he told stories about them through parables. The parables held and perpetuated the deep moral and philosophical principles which described the way God wanted us to relate to him and one another. This is a much more timeless and effective method than simply developing, like Bret said, some hyper-technical, discussing it through game theory lens, right? They wouldn't have understood that. They didn't have, obviously, the contextual understanding of that stuff to derive any value from it. But also, it's just not as effective. Like, even people who like that kind of stuff and who can deal with it and find it interesting, I think if we're being honest, I enjoy listening to things like that, listening to deep theological, philosophical argumentation and these thoughts and these ideas and seeing them wrestled out. But the people who I think have probably had the most impact on me, and even the ideas which have stuck with me the most firmly, are the ones which I have seen work in practice, both in my life and the lives of other people. And I think that type of persuasion, that type of truth expression is just much more timeless and much more effective than issuing, like he said, even a true cold, hard technical argument.
Right? It's not a good argument. Even if it's a true argument, nobody's going to get it. Nobody's going to care. Right? So that's not how humans become enlightened. Humans become enlightened because of the power of a narrative that causes them to modify their behavior so that they do function more effectively in light of all of the game theoretic hazards that are always jeopardizing us. Which then answers your other question, I think. Why do the bad patterns, if it's simply good to include others in your in-group, why don't we just simply evolve to default to that and never waver? And the problem is that there's a competition between short-term gain and long-term gain. Effectively, the upgrade in which you in-group more people is much better in the long run. But in the short run, individuals who decide to take advantage of that may have some advantage inside of the group, right? And so building a structure in which you can't get away with it increases the effectiveness of the moral point.
This is a fantastic point. An understanding, a clear understanding of what he's expressing now, and he's going to continue, and I'll let it play in a second, provides a very clear understanding that everybody in this country needs to think about and get to the point where we better understand. What is the function and purpose of authoritative institutions like the government, our school systems, church structures? What is the goal and function of those? And are they valuable? The goal and the function of institutions is to construct, to communicate, and to perpetuate a clearly defined set of guiding principles, which is in line with and models an objective aim for all of society. And it is extremely valuable, and I would say indispensable, insofar as it accurately and effectively accomplishes that goal. Now, in order to do that, necessarily those institutions have to have a certain level of authority because they have to be able to implement these ideas. They have to be able to implement these rules, regulations, laws, dictates. And as our favorite friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, his grandfather says, with great power comes great responsibility. So in wielding that authority, the institution and the members, the fallible human beings who make it up, are constantly met with the temptation to wield said authority over the people in a tyrannical manner for the benefit and the pursuit of their own subjective gains, right? Or to be the kind of people who wield authority in a wise and a godly and an honoring way, which is beneficial for others and glorifying to the Lord. And sometimes that requires dispensing with momentary pursuits of self-gratification and whatever is beneficial, most beneficial for the self. Big role. That's why with great power comes great responsibility, right? So that's what Bret is talking about when he says there's a wrestling between short-term gain and long-term gain. So the point he's getting at is that these people who maybe are pushing back on, from his perspective here, that are pushing back on the inclusion of a broadening group of people, this in-group he's referring to, might be doing so because they feel that the greater inclusion will threaten the position that they have in the already established in-group. And his point is, if they will do this at their own temporary expense, then they will be afforded in the future a better outcome. So societally, individually, he doesn't get into that to that level of nuance, but it's the principle that's at play here that he's talking about. And I agree with it. I think it's actually one of the beautiful gifts of God. I will be whole. I will be purposeful. I will have my needs met, like in practice, really, in a lot of cases, like as he's talking about, this is sort of the component he's discussing here. To the degree that I realize that the world doesn't revolve around me, my life is best spent in a way which serves and honors God and others, and that which serves others in pursuit of honoring God, because that's the chief aim which he put us here for, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those two commandments were given at the same time, as to suggest their inseparability, right? They are linked. And getting to the point where you realize I can sacrifice my immediate, everybody just walks around. They're just like this, just all the time. I don't want to be offended. I don't want to lose something. I don't want to lose this opportunity to make a little bit of money. I'll screw a person over if I need to do in order to get it. I don't want to lose this argument. I don't want to cede any authority in this particular relationship because it might negatively affect me. Your whole life will suck if you live that way. If that is the model you take, if that's the algorithm you run, you will never have enough. You will never have deep, meaningful relationship. You will cut yourself off from achieving the very thing you're attempting to achieve by utilizing that algorithm. And that's really the principle, the biblical principle, which he's kind of discussing here that he sees, which is super, super cool. But he's discussing it from a sort of a much more strictly biologically utilitarian standpoint.
If you have everybody calculating that it's morally, you should do the morally right thing if you are in a position to be observed. And if you're not in a position to be observed, then you should do whatever is most profitable, right? Civilization breaks down. If, on the other hand, you take a narrative and you say, nobody ever gets away with anything, it's being observed, it's being recorded, and it may be profitable in the short run, but there's an awful lot of punishment that will come later, right? Frankly, I don't even know if the sentence I just said is a religious narrative or a translation of game theory. It's the same thing.
Right, and I would say that everything you're saying, which is complex, quite, is an argument for a creator, because the design is so brilliant as you're describing it, and the end result, of course, is like the perpetuation of the species, of all species.
I tend to like this idea of testing the validity of a particular worldview by its fruit, right? Which is obviously, that's a biblical principle, but it's also just like the most logically consistent, most rational methodology by which we could test the efficacy of an algorithm, right? Does it actually calculate out? Does it work? When we use language like that, they're about to get into this a little bit. When we say, does it work? Does it produce fruits? Does it produce valuable outcomes? We are making metaphysical judgments. We are appealing to a moral hierarchy of value whereby we categorize things as less good, more good, less desirable, more desirable, against the sort of metric of what we ought to be striving in the direction of. And so they're going to get into that in a second, a little bit, in a different way. We'll talk about it.
That, like, that's an accident? Like, because you're describing a system with intent. And that intent comes from where? You're describing a system with a goal.
I am describing a system with a goal, not with intent. Yeah, the system has a goal, and
The goal is the intent, right?
The word goal, the reason he's attempting to make the distinction, the word intent implies some degree of sentience, whereas the word goal, it strips that word of that particular connotation so as to get away from the implication that if biology seems to all function in an orderly and goal-oriented manner, that it must be designed, there must be a mind at bottom which intended it to work that way. That's why he would deploy goal over intent, is because he doesn't like the implication that intent has.
The intent is to achieve the goal.
well, that is the sticking point. That
I mean, this doesn't make any sense.
no, it makes a lot of it makes.
It doesn't make any sense without it. Well, I don't want to use the phrase intelligent design, but like,
Well, let's take a parallel example, and
Okay.
we could trip over the parallel example if
I
we,
just think
if we
you've made an amazing case for God, and I didn't know if you thought of yourself as an evangelist. But
No,
you
I've-
just convinced me.
I've made a very compelling case for belief in God.
Well, but what's
Not
the
for
other?
That is an elevation of utilitarian function of the belief, divorced from the implication of the efficacy of the belief itself. I don't know how you get around this other than just by denying it, ignoring it. He's going to attempt to do it in a second, and I love it. It's awesome.
What's the other
existence of God.
explanation?
Well, that's just the thing. Is the other explanation is that there are processes that function. Let's take two examples. Okay, if we talk about the behavior of a seedling, right? A seed is planted, it breaks open, it germinates, and the seedling rises against gravity and breaks the surface, and it puts out its two little solar panels. And at that point, it bends towards
Yes.
the sun. You could say, what is the other explanation for that other than a desire to reach the sunlight? And the answer is actually, in this case, we know the mechanism, and it's amazing,
Yeah. No, I agree.
but it's not desire.
So his point is sort of that it may just be the case that general goal orientation is a necessary biological function of reality itself, right? Just the physical world just has given rise to goal orientation for its own perpetuation. And the desire here on the strictly materialist side is to divorce the idea of this cold-hearted, goal-oriented function from intention. The problem here is Bret has essentially just said, well, here's the example of the seedling. We know why the seedling sprouts and grows towards the sun. We know why it does that, but we don't know why it does that. We know how it does that. We understand the mechanisms. We can describe the mechanisms at play. That tells us nothing about why it does that. So this goes back to the whole apologetics argument between the theist and the atheist, where the theist says, look, if I grant you one miracle, sure, you can explain the way that biological processes function, but you can't tell me why they function. So it can absolutely be the case, to give Bret his credit, you can understand front to back so deeply, in fact, that you could probably get to the point where you could recreate the mechanism and the whole thing without knowing why it exists, without knowing why it does that, but simply having a very deep technical understanding of how it does it. I'll give you this example. What if I took a mechanics class? I'm going to become a Ford technician, and I took me a little 8-week program, a little 8-week class, and at the end of that class, the instructor stood up and he said, all right, we've gone through 8 weeks of this. You understand front to back how the internal combustion engine was constructed. You understand every mechanism at play. You understand all the chemical reactions occurring. You can build the components. You can recreate the thing from nothing. You can literally, we taught you how to ore the raw materials out of the ground and create the freaking engine block and build all the components around it. You can now do that. So there's no real need to talk anymore about Henry Ford. He didn't exist. We can dispense with the idea that the creator of the product, we can dispense with the idea that he existed because now we have intimate understanding of the mechanisms by which they operate and act. You would think that the guy who is teaching that class had lost his mind. It is exactly the same thing. Because we understand the mechanisms at play during particular biological processes, that somehow gives us the ability to dispense with the causal explanation. So we have done nothing to deal at all with the causal explanation for why the thing works at all. Why did it come into existence at all? Why does it do those things? Again, it would be like saying a computer is running a particular algorithm. If I ask ChatGPT, hey, calculate this math problem for me, its goal is to calculate the math problem. But ChatGPT doesn't have the intention, right? Intention is something which is a sort of metaphysical attribute of sentience. It's not something we would attribute to a product, a machine, a process which is devoid of sentience. But we all know, if I use the computer as an example, it was built by a person who absolutely had an intention. And the intention was to cause the mechanisms at play to function in the direction of a particular goal. That's the implication. And that's the implication which is attempting to be avoided by the use of goal instead of intent. Goal still implies some degree of intent, but maybe less so, right? They need to invent a word which somehow describes intentless goal orientation. I don't know how. I'm not sure how. Or intentionless goal orientation.
But it expresses a value, though. And the value is life is better than death.
It expresses...
To exist is better than not to.
Yes, it expresses an objective, but not a desire.
I'm not sure. I mean, it's a semantic question. I don't know. I see a huge difference between the two, but
that's exactly my point. Is what I'm not trying to compel people that the answer that I think I can see is right for them. I'm trying to convince people that the answer I think I see is actually not dogged by some paradox that makes it unviable. It's too cumbersome to live by it. But it's, just like the example of the baseball game.
It's not a paradox. It just logically follows. And if you honestly take the implication of the idea that these systems have an aim, you're kind of forced, if you're dealing honestly with the information, to conclude that biological processes which have clear goals, they have clear objectives, there has to be an objective giver. Now look, I'm perfectly happy to have people like Bret, honestly, I think even Alex O'Connor is coming around a little bit as far as, at least from a utilitarian standpoint, he's pretty dadgum morally and socially conservative. At least he's moving in that direction. I shouldn't go so far as to say he's conservative or anything, but he's getting more conservative, I would say. I'm super happy that there's people that deal in those spaces that are really thoughtful men, sharp men that think through ideas well, that are talking about these things and they're kind of popularizing this type of discussion, these type of conversations. And I love that. I think it's hyper valuable. And I'm happy to have as many people who say, you know what, we've kind of been dealing with this hyper leftist thing for a while. We adopted for a time the idea of truth is subjective and we can just write our own destiny subjectively in our own emotionally driven hearts and go our own directions and things will go well. And they're dispensing with that, and because they're seeing the value, the effectiveness of an objective, morally, guided society. I love that. That's great. That is a win. And I think like our role as believers who like that stuff as well, but who seem to have accepted the implication, to discuss it to the best of our ability in exciting and in engaging ways. That might be saying too much about my little videos and the few people who watch them, but like doing the best we can to do that to the best of our ability, I think is what helps bridge the the gap. It helps provide the bridge from, okay, I accept the utilitarian value of these ideas. They seem to cause a better society. They seem to benefit my own personal life. And let the people who are in that space rest in that, sit in that for a while, a couple years, maybe decades even, until hopefully they go, all right, it's not enough for me to understand the mechanism. I want to know the cause as well. And I don't just want to intellectually know of the cause. I want to know the cause personally, because that is the implication. If there are these biologically observable processes with functions and aims, the implication there is that there is a mind, there is a relational being who has moral goals and aims for his creation. So then obviously the conclusion there is, man, we would probably be best served in not only trying to attend to what God would have us do, but also to know him and know who he is.
The baseball game happens. It's made of atoms and energy. And you could imagine commentators sitting there describing the energy and the material in, the objects. And it would be the worst, most cumbersome commentary at a sports event conceivable.
But it wouldn't really tell you anything useful.
Right. That's the point.
Right. So what I see by your description is an entire universe screaming at the top of its collective lungs, life is better than death.
No, only the living stuff thinks that.
Well, I mean, I'm not exactly sure we can measure or define living as precisely as we think we can. But whatever. I mean,
I sort of appreciate the distinction, I guess. I know what Tucker's saying, and I think there's a ton of truth to it. I think so. So Bret's sort of in the back of his head, he's going, all right, you're tying this into, you're making it all about life and death, and life is better than death. Let me see if I can kind of find well, rocks aren't alive. They function in whatever capacity they function according to the same regulatory laws, physical laws of the universe, as the biologically, the living creatures as well, right? The point there is the order. It's the order. It's the aim. It is the fact that we can understand clear and intimate descriptions of the mechanisms which describe the functions of all of these processes, these biological processes, both of the things that we would define as neatly, categorically, full-throated living creatures, as well as things that maybe are not living, but they're still composed of biological material, right? Or physical material, matter, which is at minimum constrained by mathematics. If mathematics describes the way by which the universe came into existence pre-matter, before there was time, before there was space, before there was matter, the mathematical dictates would necessarily pre-exist space, time, and matter. If something pre-exists space, time, and matter, if it exists outside of space, time, and matter, it is by definition, it is categorically metaphysical. Math is conceptual. Math is not something you can pick up and hold in your hand and measure on a scale and feel it. You can't smell it. It is something which only exists in the conceptual realm. The conceptual realm is exclusively within the mind. So you follow the trail and you get down to, mathematics pre-exists all of physical reality. Mathematics is a conceptual idea. It's an idea. It's a concept by which we understand the functions of the physical world. That means it must have existed in a mind, especially when you consider how unbelievably complex, orderly, knowable, and predictable mathematics is. You start to go, oh my goodness. So mathematics underpins sort of biological functions. It's the chief sort of algorithm which is causing all of the physical processes to occur. So in that sense, all of creation, all of the universe is crying out, maybe not life is better than death explicitly all the time, but order is better than chaos. From where does order come?
But in general, living things that we describe as living, that we can observe, are all moving in the same direction. And the message, being a message guy, I can
Yep.
discern this. Life is better than death.
Yeah, I agree. Another example. Okay. Let us agree that love is a profoundly, I'm struggling for words even good enough to describe it, is a profoundly transformative property of life that is as close to a North Star as a human being can have. And I don't mean just romantic love, familial love, love of country, all of these things. Love is this tremendously powerful force.
Amen.
Now let us say there's actually a lot of neurochemistry that we can describe relative to love. Which story do I want people living by? Oh, definitely the narrative one in which you just simply surrender to the power of this thing and you allow it to be a guide.
All right, that's absolutely not true. So he is, respectfully to him, conflating infatuation with love. Well, let me be fair. When the secular world talks about love, they talk about feelings. And so Bret is appealing to the idea of love as a feeling, not as a decision. So to the extent that we can understand the infatuating feelings associated with that which we often refer to as love, sure, that is true. But actual love, even as he described it, where he says love of country and love of, these are not necessarily feelings. They may have accompanying feelings with them, right? So this love, the love of country, the love of my wife, even the love of my child, tremendous emotional engagement there for sure. There's tremendous emotional experience there, but not always. Much of the time, actually, to love effectively, to pursue love as an aim, it relies on the fact that I understand that love is not a feeling. If I buy this idea, and I'm pointing this out because he's about to sort of build an argument on the basis of the fact that we can, and I'm not trying to pick on him. He's being very like good faith and nice. I'm not trying to make this like he's wrong about this. I want to clarify on some of these ideas. He's about to construct this sort of point about how, we can describe everything through science. That's kind of what he's saying. We can explain everything through science. See, we understand that the chemical processes which are occurring in your brain, those produce the phenomenon associated with being in love, right? Okay, sure. But I would argue that feelings are simply the accompanying bolstering. They are a gift from God given to us to enhance our experiences here on earth. But love is not a feeling. Love is a decision which precedes the feeling, which may or may not follow. Sometimes it comes, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it leaves, sometimes it's there. And love, the type of love which actually is transformative, like Bret is talking about, the love which transforms not only myself, but the world around me, society, over the course of time, perpetually, is absolutely a decision. It is not a feeling. The feeling, the infatuation, which sometimes accompanies, romantic experiences and the love of my children and the particular draw to one particular thing over another that I have, they are valuable. They are exciting. They're something that I'm thankful for as a believer. Thank you, God, you gave us these things to just enhance, to color our experiences in a magical and seemingly mystical way. But they are certainly not something which we ought to submit to or be led by, or that we should water all of love down to. There is agency in love. Love is a decision. It is not a feeling.
That's definitely, I don't want to live amongst people who view love as just a bunch of chemical reactions.
Good. You shouldn't, because that's not what it is. So this isn't just a choice not to view it that way. You're not just saying, well, I'm just going to choose not to believe that that's what it is. No, it's a recognition of the fact that it is not that. That is not what love is. That doesn't represent a complete understanding of love, and oftentimes doesn't represent love at all.
Yada, yada, yada. Right? That's a horrifying dystopia. But it doesn't make it untrue that love is mediated through neurochemistry.
Yeah, why can't both be true? That doesn't.
They are. That's exactly my point. That's exactly my point.
Right.
They are both true.
But only one describes the purpose of it, the origin of it.
Only one is useful for living.
No, but I'm saying the theist believes he understands why this is happening.
Right.
The atheist has no idea.
Well, in a sense.
So really, that's the question. It's not a question of how things happen. It's a question of why they happen.
Well, I'm trying to talk to two camps in a sense,
Right.
And maybe this will be more of a theme of our discussion on other topics here, but there's a kind of nuance that has become impossible. And I'm trying to make a point to the atheists about what they've failed at and why they're not reaching lots of people and why they're losing ground. And I'm also trying to make a point to the theological folks about Darwinism and about the utility of figuring out how to reconcile these things rather than view them as competing explanations.
There's not another person I know who I could have a conversation on this topic about in the way that we're doing. And I just want to say, I think you're one of the most open-minded in a good way
Yep.
people I've ever met.
I
Thank
agree.
you.
I love him. Love him and his brother. They're awesome.